footprint buried on site or be a nuclear storage site indefinitely, for sure.
Thank you. I think this is an important point because the senator from Oklahoma mentioned that part of the problem we have here is that we've not come up with a location for disposal or long-term storage of a nuclear site, whether it's Yucca Mountain or where else. And my point is that even if we agree today on a site, wherever that is, it would still take 20 years to develop that site. In the meantime, cities like Zion remains a de facto nuclear storage facility, and that's simply not fair to the community. And so as our nation debates the permanent solution to safely dispose of and store radioactive nuclear waste, it's my hope that we can find common ground around a simple principle, that until a permanent solution is implemented, the federal government should help communities deal with economic and social harms of stranded nuclear waste. Mr. Nabel, can you explain why the city of Zion needs Congress to pass the Stranded Act and finally fulfill the Nuclear Waste Policy Act of 1986 original vision of distributing economic impact assistance payments to help stranded communities offset the economic and social harms of temporarily storing nuclear waste, even if that temporary ends up being 40 years?
Sure. It was agreed to in 1982 that there was a social and economic impact to municipalities that stored waste on an interim basis. So this is just reiterating that need. But during the time that we've been a storage site, that the plant's been decommissioned and closed, we've been operating at a annual deficit. Basically, we've been treading water every year, and every year we go a little further beneath the surface. We don't have the opportunity for redevelopment. Our property tax base has declined significantly. We've been irreparably damaged financially, community-wide, as a result of this. And this is, this is crucial to us being able to survive, to even get to a point where we can talk about moving the waste, or even get to a point where we can talk about reuse. We are less staffed for police, fire, and public works than we were in 1998. And we're handling 3 times the calls and service demands from the community. Over 60% of our infrastructure is 70 years or older, and we don't even have the funds to address those issues. We're just trying to survive and still be in existence. And this will help us to address those deficits, to try and put a plan in place to get a return on that investment so that we can be self-sustaining. We can dig out of that hole to get to the point where we can even start to address those issues.
Thank you. And I think this is critical to say that this is, passing the Stranded Act will actually help us make good decisions on where to move the nuclear fuel. And I think it will act almost as a pressure valve to take the pressure off making a decision immediately to say, choose Yucca Mountain or someplace like that, so that we can make good decisions on where this waste will go. Because in the meantime, the waste can remain where it is in a way that the community that's holding the waste can sustain it. The Economic Development Administration administers the Assistance to Nuclear Closure Communities program, often referred to as the NCC initiative. As I noted in my, Mr. Nabel, can you explain why the EDA's NCC initiative falls short in meeting the urgent needs of stranded communities like Zion, and address why it's so important to expand the EDA support, as my Stranded Act will seek to do?
Absolutely. The program as it's currently written is a nice idea for maybe like a step 3 in our process. As I mentioned, we'd be lucky to have the luxury to others is when you're worried about trying to put food on the table for your family, you're not even worried. You can't even consider about how you're going to fix the leaky roof. So development projects, first of all, on a site or in a community that cannot attract redevelopment because of tax base or because of blighted property, is just not feasible. But secondly, it also has matching requirements on there that we just simply can't add to our budget. Hemorrhaging as a result of 20 years of spiraling property values due to the decommissioning. So there's a limitation on that. It's a good step 3, but the Stranded Act addresses the step 1 needs.
Thank you. I have additional questions, but I will submit those for the record. I yield back.
Thank you, Senator Duckworth. Senator Kelly and then Senator Markey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate you having this hearing today on these important pieces of legislation. I want to start by discussing the American Nuclear Infrastructure Act of 2021. Ranking Member Capito and Senator Whitehouse's bipartisan bill, which I support. Nuclear energy is critical to our shared goal of reducing carbon emissions and fighting the effects of climate change, and this bill would provide financial support and more regulatory certainty to next-generation advanced nuclear reactors, help more Americans get trained for good-paying, high-skilled jobs in the nuclear industry, improve coordination with international nuclear regulators, and support nuclear investments made by our allies, and provide financial support for our aging nuclear fleet. Important to me, this bill builds upon the work I've done to support the cleanup of abandoned uranium mines in tribal communities. As a member of the bipartisan group of senators who negotiated the infrastructure law, I fought to secure $5 billion for investments for Superfund sites and brownfield cleanups, including for more than 500 abandoned uranium mines on the Navajo Nation. And I appreciate steps taken in this legislation to further strengthen U.S. global leadership in next-generation nuclear energy technologies, U.S. global leadership in next-generation nuclear energy technologies to compete with China and Russia. And so this brings me to my first question. Ms. Korsnick, can you expand upon your testimony on the ways that China and Russia are threatening to rival U.S. leadership on the international stage, and how the American Nuclear Infrastructure Act's provisions relating to international nuclear reactor export activities and international regulatory competition would help to combat the challenges that are posed by Russia and China?
Yes, thank you, Senator. If you would imagine the partnership that grows when two countries work together on commercial nuclear, it essentially forges a 100-year relationship from design to build to operate to decommission. And so the idea of working together with nuclear forms very strong geopolitical bonds. This is something that we should strategically look at as supportive of United States geopolitical interests. In that same way, China and Russia are very interested in controlling other countries' energy supply for reasons that you actually have seen, play out even over in Europe over gas lines. For example, there's a lot of power in controlling somebody's electricity supply. China is going all in. I think they're building 20 reactors right now, and they have a strategic plan to build a whole lot more. China right now looks like the United States in the 1950s. They're building all kinds of different types of reactors. They want to get good at all of them. And see as much. I can't say that it's not happening. I can say both of those countries have expressed common interest in certain other countries. For example, they're both interested in places in Africa. They've both expressed interest in Brazil. And so they're very interested in a sort of a longer-term strategic play where it's their technology that is operating in as many countries as they can make that happen.
Thank you, Ms. Korsnick. Mr. Cohn, I think he's remote. I wanted to ask you about the role nuclear energy can play as a clean, firm source of electricity. As you can imagine, as the sunniest state in the nation, Arizona is a leader in solar energy deployment and development, and there's a lot more growth to come. But reliability is a challenge, especially in Arizona's long, hot summer months. when air conditioning is non-negotiable. Mr. Cohn, for states like Arizona, which are prime markets for solar energy deployment, what role does a firm source of energy like nuclear energy play in ensuring grid reliability and keeping costs low for customers?
Thank you for the question, Senator Kelly. Yes, all the studies that I've seen for the Southwest, and this is true for all the studies actually have been done for all the geographies I've seen in the U.S., suggest that renewables and nuclear don't really compete. What they do is complement each other. So even in a very sunny state like Arizona, you do have a great solar energy resource, but it's quite variable by season by a factor of as much as 2 to 1. So what nuclear does is provide a sort of always on base, if you will, even if it has to be curtailed at certain times or ramped down on certain days because of very, very high solar production. There are typically still a lot of cost savings in having that always available source. It's also true that Palisades in Arizona is a sort of a mainstay right now of the Western grid reliability. So renewables are great for reducing costs at the margin, but what nuclear provides is a firm base when the sun isn't shining, when the wind isn't blowing, and that's often true for weeks, even months, or that it isn't blowing at the levels that are maximum. Nuclear can provide and fill those spaces and ensure a much lower cost grid. So it's often nuclear versus renewables. I think that's a false distinction. They work very well together.
Yeah, and I think, folks are often unaware that when the demand is the highest is not actually when the sun is shining the brightest and is directly overhead. I mean, demand is usually in the hottest part of the day. It also happens to be the time that people are coming home from work. And shortly thereafter, the sun is at a much lower angle and is not generating as much electricity. So this is a good option, to fill that demand gap. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Kelly, thanks so much for joining. Senator Markey, you are next. And I think Senator Padilla may be trying to join us after you question the witnesses. But thank you for allowing the other two senators to go ahead of you. Thank you.
No, of course. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So we have a moment here where we can just kind of do a review of the nuclear industry as it sits today, including the 2 nuclear power plants in Georgia, the Vogtle plants, which were proposed as $14 billion for the 2 units to be generating electricity. They've had their problems over the years, let's be honest, and it's up to $30 billion now for the 2 units. And still, they're not without their difficulties. So let's just talk about that as a state of the art for the industry, and there still is no known meltdown for a solar or a wind project in the United States. So the safety issues, obviously, around nuclear are not small. And in the infrastructure bill, which has already passed, there were $6 billion for the nuclear industry that was built into the infrastructure bill, which we all voted for. And in the Build Back Better bill, Mr. Chairman, there is, as passed by the House, and hopefully we could get to it in the Senate, there is actually $23 billion in production tax credits for the nuclear industry just through the year 2027. I know Senator Manchin is arguing to cover it out for 10 years. So that would obviously increase it, but $23 billion in that bill. So from my perspective, I think that we should just realize that this is an industry that has had difficulty in actually bringing any new plants online. It gets more and more costly as each year goes by, and yet, we should also be focusing on the wind and solar and other industries. So if we're going to do something, we just have to do it together, and that's actually what the Build Back Better bill is. Build Back Better bill deals not just with nuclear, $23 billion worth of production tax credits, but also tax breaks for wind and solar and battery technologies and all-electric vehicles, so that we're looking at this from a comprehensive perspective. So, Mr. Cohen, do you agree that we should be investing in mass deployment of renewable energy and not just focusing exclusively on nuclear in order to achieve our climate and clean grid potential?
Yes, thank you, Senator, for that question. Absolutely agree with that. We've been big supporters of the renewable tax credits and all other kinds of RD&D and deployment. It absolutely has to be a balanced portfolio. That's what all the modeling suggests. And in fact, most of the modeling suggests that the zero carbon grid of the future is likely to be dominated actually by sources like wind and solar. Again, nuclear can play a supporting role, but without that inexpensive wind and solar at scale, the cost of decarbonization would be much more expensive. So absolutely, both of these policies have to work in tandem.
Yeah, so in addition to nuclear plant bailout, which is in this bill, there is also a doubling down on the infrastructure bill, and it's $2.5 billion advanced reactor demonstration program by making taxpayers foot that bill for additional advanced reactor activities, and supporting that continued nuclear generation. Also then raises questions about nuclear waste and how our country is going to handle those issues. Mr. Cohen, do you agree that a long-term solution for nuclear waste needs to be a principal component of any discussion of additional nuclear generation in our country?
I think that it is a problem that needs to be solved. I believe it's a problem we can solve. I think we're going to have to get way out of the box in terms of how we solve it in the way that other industrialized countries like Sweden and Finland have managed to do. I do not view a permanent solution as an absolute precondition, however, for any additional deployment of nuclear. I believe that these two issues can be pursued in parallel.
Okay, well, from my perspective, this is a perfect subject for discussion in the Build Back Better bill. We clearly are going to be looking at technologies that should be invested in order to deal with our clean energy programs. And this is a very good hearing to have in order to explore this one part of it. But I will say again, a part that's unlikely to add over the next 10 years a significant amount of electricity, given the Vogtle plant experience. But if it's coupled with tax breaks for wind and solar, and all-electric vehicles, and battery storage technologies, well, that's a good discussion, because then we can just allow the market to work in order to demonstrate ultimately which of these technologies is going to be producing electricity between now and 2030, let's say. And again, I hate to say this, but it's unlikely that there will be another new nuclear power plant that will be authorized in that period of time. But I'm very open in the Build Back Better bill to adding on to what we already voted for in the infrastructure bill for the nuclear industry, but I think it should all be tied together as a all of the above strategy in this clean energy field. So I thank you, Mr. Chairman, very much, and I thank the ranking member.
The senator from Massachusetts raises an interesting and timely point in the clean energy tax credit provisions within Build Back Better, which I've started to call Build Back Slimmer. But there are provisions that actually do, the tax provisions provide production tax credits that are my staff and I and others on this committee were involved in. We have tax provisions for clean hydrogen, green hydrogen that are in that legislation. So my hope is that as we come back and trying to find the portions of significant portions, I hope, of Build Back Better, Build Back Slimmer, that they will include some of the things that we're talking about right here. It makes a lot of sense.
And can I just say, the beauty of Build Back Better is that all these incentives are technology neutral. So yes, it's hydrogen, that's right. It's nuclear, but it's wind and solar and battery storage technology. So it's technology neutral, and then they'll all be there, and it's just a race to the finish line at that point. So I just think that's important for us to understand.
Good. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Senator Padilla was trying to join us by WebEx. Do we know if he's on or off? All right. If he comes on, let us know. Senator Capito, would you like to go next?
I have just a couple quick questions. I wanted to ask, first of all, before I do that, because I forgot to do this before, I would like to ask unanimous consent to insert two articles into the record. One is an article from Reuters titled, "California Urged to Keep Nuclear Plant Open to Meet Climate Goals," and the other is from Forbes titled, "NRC's Rejection of Okla Application," which we've heard about in this hearing, shows U.S. is miles behind China in advanced nuclear reactors. And I would say to my friend who's leaving from Massachusetts that I am for an all-of-the-above energy plan myself. You're just leaving several very significant energy-producing materials out of your what you were talking about. You know what I'm talking about: natural gas, coal, carbon capture, utilization. I'll just put that on the record. My question is, you can head out now. That was my comment to you. Thank you. My question is on.
I just would add, carbon capture, Waxman Markey had $200 billion for carbon capture and $200 billion for carbon capture and sequestration. So again, we're totally open to any negotiation on carbon, hydrogen, all those issues.
Thank you. Ms. Korsnick, on the, during COVID, there were lessons learned all around the horn, I think, on everything, but certainly some lessons learned in the NRC in the way they did some inspections by, greater remote access to plant data. I'm wondering if you have any examples of how they've improved, these plants have improved their operations because of some of the lessons learned during the COVID pandemic.
Yes, thank you, Senator. We actually had great success during COVID. We were able to run all of the refueling outages and significant work at all of our nuclear plants during this COVID experience. And as you mentioned, one of those things was to kind of think about maybe more creative ways that the NRC could conduct their oversight of our operations. And at the end of the day, it proved in some cases more efficient and helpful for them. And so we very much look to identify some of those best practices and integrate those lessons learned into permanent processes and procedures of the NRC. So, for example, they were able to conduct several of their inspections remotely, and not everything, I'd say, avails itself to that kind of inspection. And so we're not saying we don't need NRC inspectors on site by any means, but there were ways we think that they can run their business more efficiently, and we allowed them sort of more access remotely to our sites to facilitate it. I think it was a win-win.
Good, good. Mr. Harrell, a final question from me on the Stranded Act. I didn't know if, obviously there's a cost to everything, and there is an authorization level, I believe, in the act that Senator Duckworth has brought forward. I didn't know if you at ClearPath had done any kind of estimate as to what the actual cost of something such as the Stranded Act could cost.
Yeah, it's a great question, Senator Capito. I mean, if these economic impact grants continued indefinitely towards 2050, we're looking at $2 trillion, and so no doubt the status quo serves no one well, and I think that includes Zion, Illinois, and so we need a variety of solutions to the spent fuel problem. And I think innovation can play a major role in that. And so I think you've included some important provisions in ANEA to get at the support for communities who formerly hosted sites. I think one of the biggest things we do, and kudos to you and many members of this committee, including the chairman, on the infrastructure bill, one of the biggest things we can do is avoid closing these plants altogether so we don't have this economic story. And then, advanced reactors can play a role in using spent fuel. And there's innovation in storage of fuel. There's exciting companies like Deep Isolation that are looking at storing spent fuel in boreholes. And so I think that's an area where we could wisely spend in dollars and get to a solution. Because I do worry if a $2 trillion program over the next 30 years is established, we're just perpetuating the same problem that exists.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Capito. Again, thanks for your leadership on not just this issue, but specifically on one of the two bills that we're holding this hearing on today. It's been a great conversation. I think we've been joined remotely by Senator Padilla by WebEx. And Senator Padilla, if you're there, happy to recognize you at this time. Are you there?
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate the flexibility. I was there in person earlier. As you know, multiple committees are meeting, so I'm joining virtually. But want to begin by recognizing that my home state of California has actually 3 nuclear facilities in various stages of decommissioning: San Onofre, Rancho Seco, and Humboldt Bay, with the most recent action being the NRC's November 18th announcement that it has terminated the license for Humboldt Bay's Unit 3 and released a unit site for unrestricted use. Operating nuclear power plants provides economic opportunities for local communities during their operation. And as plants are decommissioned, communities often experience a significant loss of tax revenue and a loss of good paying jobs. I know Senator Duckworth already spoke earlier about the Stranded Act and what it could mean for communities undergoing these sorts of transitions, but wanted to point out another unique element of the decommissioning process and future use of sites. You know, some of California's decommissioned facilities are connected to or located very near existing electrical transmission infrastructure. And given the stigma around reusing former nuclear facilities because of cleanup concerns and otherwise, it does beg the question of how we can best put this land use after facilities are decommissioned, how we best use the area. So, question for Mr. Nabel: beyond just financial support, are there additional support or services that the government could provide to smooth transitions and maintain local economies following the closures of the nuclear power plants?
Thank you, Senator Padilla. I believe Senator Duckworth's act addresses that in part with the task force and the creative grant program or gift prize program. As you mentioned, there's a stigma associated with a decommissioned plant that you can look at 90 acres of lakefront property and say that'd be fantastic, but who's going to want to build on a prior nuclear footprint? You know, and on a local level, we try and look at ways to reuse that, and we try and attract business. We try and look at is there a potential for a natural gas plant? Again, you have the switch yard there for the electric grid infrastructure. So anything that can be identified through federal resources to help get us back on track would obviously be appreciated. And I think it's necessary to dig out of the hole for our community, for yours, for everyone that's affected by this ultimately. As I mentioned earlier, we have to make sure that we're around to be able to benefit from that, because something like that is going to take quite a while to develop and see the benefit of. So step one of the Stranded Act deals with non-competitive grants, but there is hope that ultimately there will be some sort of highest and best use for that property. But we know that it will never be what we originally had, what was there, and what was promised, especially while the spent fuel is still on site.
All right, to be continued. The second question, let me frame it here. Currently, there's roughly 86,000 metric tons of commercial spent fuel sitting in communities, not just across California, but across the country. And that figure is increasing at the rate of about 22 metric tons per year. Now, the waste is currently stored at 121 sites in 35 states, mostly at the very same facilities that produced it. In the next few years, all of California's nuclear power plants will be shut down or in the decommissioning process, which will leave the spent nuclear fuel at each power plant site. Again, referencing California specifically here. As I'm sure you all know, despite safety assurances, localized storage garners intense public interest, particularly in California in light of seismic activity and earthquake risk. I know there's increasing dialogue about the consent-based siting strategy for storage, but wanted to ask Mr. Cohen this question. If an interim or permanent storage site ever did become operational, spent fuel and waste would have to be transported through countless communities from their current site to that interim or permanent storage site. How do you balance that transportation need with the alternative of leaving waste where it currently is from a risk and benefit standpoint?
It's a great question, and I'll venture a personal opinion, maybe not even an organizational opinion on this, that it has been demonstrated that we can transport nuclear waste safely. It's been done for many decades, however, the alternative, right, is to leave everything where it is. So you do have a trade-off. There's always some risk in transport, but there's also a risk, certainly, to future economic development in communities, as you've noted, in leaving things on site. I mean, I think the best thinking is that combination that we really need to move this waste. And again, I don't think it's an impossible task to do that safely. I can provide a more thoughtful and extended answer in writing if you prefer, because we think the evidence does support that you can safely transport nuclear spent fuel.
Yeah, a written response would be helpful and appreciated. Thank you both. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Senator Padilla, thanks so much for joining us and for your patience here today. We have a vote underway on the floor. I think we have about another 10, 12 minutes that I can stay here with you. It may seem longer, but it won't be long, in about 10 or 12 minutes, and I got to go run and vote. A question, I want to ask one question for Mr. Cohen. I think probably Ms. Korsnick as well. We'll leave our other witnesses off the hook on this one. But just keep in mind, I telegraphed my pitch earlier. The last question I'll ask is, where do we have some consensus here? Maybe a couple of major points for each of you to share with us. But before we get to that, Mr. Cohen, Ms. Korsnick, recent advances in nuclear and material sciences provide an opportunity to build safer and more efficient alternatives to existing nuclear fuel rod technology. These technology advancements are leading to safer, more efficient nuclear fuel rod technology called accident-tolerant fuels. These new accident-tolerant fuels can serve as an important bridge to advanced reactors, while at the same time allowing current nuclear reactors to be safer and more cost competitive. Here's my question, again for Mr. Cohen, Ms. Korsnick. Would each of you take maybe a minute and discuss what you know to be the status of accident-tolerant fuels today, just briefly? And would each of you provide maybe one policy option we should consider to support the next generation of nuclear fuels? Mr. Cohen, then Ms. Korsnick.
I might suggest that Ms. Korsnick, who's more expert on this topic, go first, and maybe
there you go. Ms. Korsnick, would you go first, please?
Great, thank you. Yeah, so your question is on advanced or accident-tolerant fuels.
Yes.
And so I think this is a wonderful opportunity for the industry. Again, American innovation at play. And I think it's going to bring forward a variety of options, whether those options are used in current reactors that we use today or the reactors of tomorrow. I think it's a great opportunity. It's likely to be more expensive. And so I think as with anything, I think you have to sort of balance the need for that additional expense with the value that it brings. And I think there is a good value proposition there. In terms of a policy option, I would suggest we have some investment today in accident-tolerant fuel. I think we should look at that investment and see if we can bring accident-tolerant fuel to the market even sooner.
All right, thank you. I'm going to, Mr. Cohen, anything very briefly you want to say, and then we'll go to the last question.
I would just add the next step is obviously to think about fuel fabrication and the full supply chain, and that needs further attention.
All right, thank you. I'll go back to my original, what I said to you at the beginning of the hearing. Pitch, well telegraphed, is right here, and the ideas. We always look on this committee, more than probably any committee in the Senate, as much as any committee in the Senate, we look on ways to find consensus, even in really where there's a lot of adversity. And what I'd ask each of you to do is just take a minute, tell us where you think there's, based on what you've heard today and said today, where there's some good areas for consensus that we ought to definitely pursue. Thanks. Let me go, I think, first with Mr. Nabel. Would you go first?
Thank you, Chairman. As far as common ground, I don't think these two bills are mutually exclusive to each other. Ania and Stranded both realize that nuclear is part of our future for green energy. The piece that needs to be included is the end process. The current process, we're an example of the benefit of nuclear while the plant was operating, regionally benefiting, other communities nationally benefiting. But the current process ended at decommissioning, where everyone kind of washed their hands of it and said, we're done. However, we were still left with the mess. So ANEA recognizes that there is a need to figure out what to do with that waste, that should be part of the process, that should be part of the overall proposal, to make sure that we have the entire beginning to end in the process, and how to best have everyone benefit from that and nobody left holding the bag.
All right, thank you. Thank you, sir. Armin Cohen, Mr. Cohen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would say, just in a preliminary comment, that I feel like there's a great deal of consensus, certainly among this panel, about what the priorities are, dealing with the legacy problems, but also making sure that there is a pathway, a viable pathway for advanced nuclear through the NRC licensing process, and also dealing with the long-term waste issue. Just a sort of an observation, which is that more than the consensus within this committee or among this panel is the fact that there is emerging consensus in the society about nuclear. I think that has changed quite a bit. It should make the job of this committee and this Congress easier. I inserted some polling data, which is quite interesting, which shows very vast majority of Americans support continued use and expanded use of nuclear energy. And in particular, the Democrats, which are often thought to have a less favorable view, are also substantially in favor of this technology. So I don't think it's rocket science to figure out what the remaining areas of concern are. Waste, safe regulation of advanced nuclear, and we still need the kind of legislation that you've put forward in recent years to speed these sort of less expensive, safer, easier to deploy reactors. So I'm heartened that there's an enormous amount of consensus, not just a bipartisan consensus in Congress, but in the society at large.
Thank you, sir. Ms. Korsnick, please.
Yes, thank you. I agree very much with Armand Cohen. I would say areas of consensus are that nuclear is a needed partner with wind and solar to create the best solution. And I think very much an opportunity as you demonstrate that these technologies can pair very well. You also actually lower consumer cost by doing that. I think another area is that American innovation is bringing forth really fantastic new nuclear options, making it more flexible and more useful, more diverse, whether it's hydrogen, whether it's high temperature steam, or whether it's electricity. So we must encourage that, and we can encourage it through the licensing process, make that more efficient, make the site permitting process also more efficient. And I'll end with the United States does, in fact, need a durable waste strategy.
Thank you. All right. Mr. Harrell, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think what I heard clearly was new American nuclear is an economic opportunity, important to global security, and a climate imperative, and it needs to be enabled now. Even Senator Markey, who was talking about a little bit of skepticism, is rooted in nuclear needs to play a significant role on a relevant climate time frame. And so legislation like ANEA is going to be necessary to bolster licensing both in the short term before the NRC completes the Part 53 process, which isn't going to be completed for another 5 years or another 3 to 5 years at least. Direct flexibility on applications, because nuclear can play a huge role outside of electrical applications, like in heavy industry. And common sense permitting, because in the end, if we're going to contribute to reducing emissions, we need to be able to build these things quickly so they can contribute to a 21st century electrical grid.
Yeah, thank you. I got just a couple of quick comments, if I could. First, thank you. I want to thank our witnesses. I want to thank all our colleagues who've come today. Especially want to thank Senator Capito and Senator Duckworth for their leadership, Senator Whitehouse, and others. I want to thank our staffs. We have staffs work very well together. And on most Thursdays, whether we're in session, Senator Capito and I meet in person, usually with at least one member of our team, Adam and Mary Frances. And I think on this Thursday, I just suggested Senator Capito, when she ran off to vote, that we think of enlarging that conversation and the people who come to the conversation, but really to focus on follow-up to this hearing today. What we've learned, where there's consensus in some areas that we might look forward to working together, really along the line that Senator Markey has suggested. We have one witness, at least one witness today from Illinois. I'm reminded that another son of Illinois, Abraham Lincoln, was once asked the question, what is the role of government? He said the role of government is to do for the people what they cannot do for themselves. And there's a great role here for us to play in this committee. I think we're well primed to build on a lot of our earlier work, to build on what was in the infrastructure bill, and to build on what could be in a slimmed down version of the Build Back Better bill. I used to be a governor and was very much involved in the National Governors Association. I headed it for a while and headed up something that the NGA called the Center for Best Practices. We always look as governors at other states to see what they're doing well, learn from what they're doing, and to learn what they're doing badly, so we know what not to do. And when I look around the world with respect to nuclear, my father's family's on the German side, roots are in Germany. I think the German people are smart and capable people. But the idea that shutting down their nuclear power plants so that they can buy natural gas from Russia, not a good idea. And maybe we can keep that lesson in line as we figure out how to avoid shutting down more nuclear power plants and creating even greater threats on the climate side. Also, my colleagues have heard me say many times, no silver bullet as we face adversity and problems to solve. No silver bullet here, but a lot of silver BBs. How about that? A lot of silver BBs. And you helped us identify a bunch of them, and we want to act on it, and sooner rather than later. Last, we had a great hearing a week or so ago on recycling. Senator Bozeman and I co-chair the Recycling Caucus in the Senate. Others on the committee are very much involved. Senator Capito and I held a hearing on recycling strategy, working hand in glove with the private sector, with EPA and others. And one of the comments that was made, I think it was something like one person's trash is another person's treasure. And in this case, spent fuel rods. Some people would call that as trash, something to demean, look at with abhorrence. There's a way, and the people in France are trying to lead the effort here, have been for a while, to figure out how to repurpose spent fuel rods and see if we can. I think, Ms. Korsnick, your statement was there's about 95% of the energy is unused within the spent fuel rods. People think that is waste. But there's actually, within that trash, if you will, there's a lot of treasure. And we got to figure out how to harvest that treasure. Last, I focused many times in this committee as chair and before. I think what I think my colleagues are about is how do we save this planet and the threats that we face with climate change, dire threats we face across the planet and climate. How can we do that? How can we do that in a way that creates economic opportunity and a lot of job creation and improves the quality of life for our people? We can do it all. We can do it, and we got to be smart enough. And when Jim Inhofe and I get together with our colleagues on a Bible study tomorrow, we say a word of prayer at the end. We'll pray for wisdom. We'll pray for wisdom for all of our colleagues and folks like you all and others around the country that we are smart enough to figure out how to do it all and get this right. And I'm encouraged that with hearings like this, we will do that. We will do that. In adversity lies opportunity. Thank you, Dr. Einstein. All right. With that, I think that I have. Thank you. All right. Before we adjourn, I love this. My favorite part of the hearing. Before we adjourn, some housekeeping. Senators will be allowed to submit written questions for the record through the close of business on Wednesday, February 23rd. We'll compile those questions, send them to our witnesses who we'll ask to reply by March the 9th if you do that. Do we have any unanimous consent requests to close with? No? Okay. I love to ask unanimous consent requests to include stuff in the record when nobody else is here. And so I'd be the only one who could object, but I don't get to do that today. So with that in mind, this hearing is adjourned. It's been a great day. And again, our thanks to all of you and to our staffs who work so hard to make this day possible. Thank you.